This is a presentation on the Overprints of France, and it is a presentation for the Winnipeg Philatelic Society, Western Canada's oldest stamp club. Now, I find French stamps interesting for a variety of reasons, and these are things where I went, well, hey, that's not the way we do things here in Canada, and of course I'm used to Canadian and British and American stamps, and the French do things differently. Now, I think if I was talking to one of my French friends, they'd say mais bien sûr or évidemment, but I find it different. So, for instance, French stamps tend to use female icons rather than the monarch. And if you learn a little bit about French history, that'll be pretty obvious why they don't have the monarch on their stamps. The last monarch or ruler was Napoleon III. And after that, well, I guess Pétain in the Second World War. But they tend to have female icons, Cerise or Liberty or Marianne, on their stamps. The Caisse d'amortissement, that was the sinking fund that they used to raise money to pay for the First World War. It's an interesting series of stamps and an interesting concept that French people would be prepared to pay an additional premium to mail letters for that purpose. And indeed, France issues a lot of semi-postal stamps. Caisse d'amortissement was just one of the things they were issuing semi-postal stamps for. The Red Cross, variety of other purposes had semi-postal stamps, and these were embraced by the French people, and they were used as much for postage as the normal postage stamps were. And I based that on the fact that most semi-postal stamps have a catalog value pretty much the same as the stamps in the surrounding period. So they were used pretty much the same. And I find that interesting. That's different from, for instance, Canada, where semi-postal stamps now are issued like once a year. And before the Olympics, not at all before. The French used stamps to raise money for the Red Cross, both overprints and semi-postal stamps. Of course, the French art stamps are classic. They're very beautiful stamps, highly collectible. Some people might collect only those. But the other thing I find unusual or different or strange to me, and again, not if you're from France, as I say, you would say mais bien sûr, are the use of overprints by France, because they use rather a lot of them. So I find it interesting. This is what stamp collecting is supposed to be about. All of these things that I have been puzzled about have caused me to do a little bit of study and investigation and find out a little more about France. And France has also had a much more turbulent history than Canada. 2 world wars fought on French soil, and all the associated annoyances of that. Kings, revolutions, emperors, just much different from the history of Canada. So these are the purposes, roughly, that I have assembled as I've looked through the overprints of France, because there are rather a lot of them, more than, for instance, in Canada. So the French probably say, how come you guys in Canada don't overprint stamps? It's a good thing to do. France does it a fair bit. So rate changes, and normally not for inflation. I couldn't find any, actually. Maybe there is one, but I couldn't find it, where the overprint was to increase the rate. And I guess if you're reducing the rate, you don't mind making it obvious that the rate has gone down by overprinting the stamp, but perhaps overprinting the stamp, as we did in Canada once, to increase the rate might annoy people. And I guess if you're increasing rates because of inflation, you have the time to prepare and design a new stamp. Caisse d'amortissement, as I mentioned, the sinking fund, which was used to raise money to pay for the First World War. They also raised taxes, but this is one of the ways that quite successfully they raised money to pay for the First World War. If you don't pay for the war, you typically end up with hyperinflation, which is what happened to Germany. They use stamps to raise money for the Red Cross, and sometimes they are overprinted. The war orphan stamps were a series of stamps that were overprinted to raise money for war orphans in the First World War. Military stamps were overprinted. The first airmail stamps were overprints, and they are rare. And that's one of the reasons that I'm not using stamps, pictures of stamps from my collection, because some of these stamps are quite valuable and I don't have them. So I've borrowed them from stampsfrance.com, and I'll mention them again at the end. But special events, a special event would occur and they would overprint the stamp for that. And this occurred in France mostly between the First World War, or a bit before, and the Second World War, or a bit after the Second World War. So we'll now look at some of these stamps. So for rate changes, La Semeuse is a classic French stamp. There are many, many issues of La Semeuse, and another female iconic character on French definitive stamps. And we see overprinted starting in 1926. And this was a series of 12 that were overprinted. So if you have a collection of French stamps, you're going to have sometimes a whole page of overprinted stamps, because they did it quite a lot. Here are some more overprints of La Semeuse, and again you see we're always reducing the value from 1 franc and 5 centimes to 50 centimes, and down to 90 centimes, and down to 1 franc 10. So we're overprinting and reducing the values. Here is Pasteur. Pasteur is one of the few males that appears on French definitive stamps. And again, we're reducing the price of the stamp from 75 centimes to 50, and from 125 to 50. Peace with an olive branch, another female icon. Also price going down from 1 franc 25 to 50 centimes. It's from 1934. Miners, 1938, there were 6 stamps in this case that were overprinted. And you can see I've listed the Scott number. This is 410. From 2 francs 15 to 1. Here are 3 stamps that were issued after the fall of France, after the German occupation and the installation of the Vichy government. There were actually 18 stamps. So we have La Semeuse, we have Mercury, and we have Peace with an olive branch. And again, in all 3 cases, the stamps are going down in value, from 35 to 30 centimes, from 75 to 50 centimes, and down to 1 franc. Marianne in 1949 and 1954, again 2 stamps overprinted to reduce the value of postage. And Mercury, the type of 1938. Now this is a interesting reprint. This is the Restoration of the Republic. France has been liberated at the end of the Second World War, and it's overprinted RF, République Française. So we're emphasizing that France has now been liberated. Caisse d'amortissement, I mentioned this. Sometimes the caisse d'amortissement stamps were specially engraved, but most of the time they were overprints. So we have La Semeuse and we have Pasteur both being overprinted. Either actually caisse d'amortissement, all spelled out, or perhaps just the initials CA. So if you have a stamp that says CA, you understand that it means caisse d'amortissement, and again used to raise money to pay for the cost of the First World War. La Semeuse, again, a classic French stamp, started in 1903 and were issued again and again through 1938. There were many different issues of La Semeuse. But you will see here we have the 10 centime stamp is overprinted to add 5 cents. And it's not, this is what I initially thought, and I'm wrong. It was 10 centimes plus 5 centimes. This is a semi-postal stamp. But it's actually 10 centimes Red Cross, 5 centimes. And they changed it later on and made it a plus sign. But I'm wondering whether people just mistook the Red Cross for a plus sign. But it clearly means 5 centimes for the Red Cross. The other interesting thing that France did with overprinting stamps is they had military stamps, overprinted FM. And if you were in the armed forces, you were given 2 stamps a month. So overseas troops on station were given 2 stamps a month for free. And this could mail a letter back to France or could mail a letter to any of the other French colonies. So that's another interesting use of the overprint. And again, the sewer, La Semeuse. The War Orphans. This was an interesting series of stamps. And it started in 1917, reissued in 1922, overprinted, and then reissued, re-engraved in 1926. And you will see that it's a 2 centime stamp. That's what it costs to mail a normal letter. But the semi-postal, to raise money for war orphans, orphelins de la guerre, is 3 centimes. So that's rather a large additional charge. It's more than doubles the price of postage. So these stamps didn't get used that much. And you will see in 1922 they reissued it, now overprinted, to reduce the amount of surcharge for the war orphans. And then in 1926 they reprinted it with the overprint on it. Now, the original 1917 series went all the way up to 5 francs. And so there was a 50 centime plus 50 centime surcharge, a 1 franc plus 1 franc, and a 5 franc plus 5 francs. And you can imagine that's a lot. Like if it takes 2 centimes to mail a letter, and you're being asked for a 5 franc surcharge to pay for war orphans, you can imagine not a lot of those got sold. So in 1922, they reprinted them all, reducing the values. So the 50 centime stamp, the surcharge was 10 centimes. The 1 franc, the surcharge was 25 centimes. And the 5 franc, the surcharge was 1 franc. Now, even then, not a lot of the higher value ones got used, so they're hard to get. And I don't have them. If I were to show you an image, I would borrow one from stampsfrance.com. Anyway, like I say, they then, in 1926, they didn't reissue them all. They reissued some. But this is one where all 3 existed. So that was War Orphans. Airmail. These were the first 3 airmail stamps, and you can see, so we have a 2 franc overprint to say Poste Arienne. And then we overprint both the Berthelot and the Pasteur stamp, both at 10 francs. And again, in 1927 or 1928, 10 francs, a lot of money. Now, you can also see the kind of plane we were using in 1927 and 28, so airmail was expensive. But if you wanted your letter to get there fast, that's how much it costs. So again, these are very expensive, and I don't have them, and that's why we borrowed the images from Stamps France. And finally, special events. This I found was interesting. The Bureau International du Travail, the 49th Congress. Now, it's now part of the International Labour Organization, which is a UN organization. And the International Labour Organization was created by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 So 1919 to 1930 does not give you 49 years. It was actually founded in 1890 in Berlin, and this is before the Franco-Prussian War, and it was to deal with the treatment of employees in mines. And there was an international organization at the time started to treat employees better. And the purpose of the International Labor Organization, and I guess in 1919, was to achieve peace by getting everyone a good job. And they figured that if people had good jobs, maybe that would be something that would stop war. You will also notice this is a different version of La Semeuse, in that she has a sunset behind her, and there's one that has she's walking on ground. There are 3 or 4 different versions of La Semeuse. Anyway, I had to do a little research to find out what the BIT, Bureau International du Travail, International Bureau of Work or Labor, and now the International Labor Organization. So, you're supposed to learn stuff and learn about history, and I did a little bit. Never knew what that stamp was when I put it in my collection. Now I do. So as I say, I borrowed these images from stampsfrance.com. They are a retail site, sells the stamps of France and many other European countries over the internet, and they have all the images there. So I express my appreciation to them. I've borrowed your images. Thank you very much. So thanks for listening.